That was such a good description. Would you like to come up here and do the talk? Yes, hi, I'm Tim. Super excited to be here. I live in Australia, where I work at BuildKite. BuildKite is a fast and flexible CI/CD system, and we do all of that with Ruby, which is really cool. And like Matt shared, I'm involved in a few open source projects, all in Ruby, Hanami, DryRB, RomRB, and we'll be talking about at least one of these today. I'm super grateful and excited to be back here. I had the privilege of coming to RubyConf Thailand in 2019, and this is actually my first time outside of Australia since then. And it's just so great to be back with a crowd of Rubyists. This is not something that I want to take for granted. So, since this was my first overseas trip in a while, I did sit down and do a bit of research before I came. And I discovered one really cool thing. And it's that in Thailand, you celebrate the New Year's 3 times over, which is amazing. We've got the 1st of January coming up, of course. Chinese New Year follows later in the month, and then Songkran in April. And this was such a great discovery for me because with the end of the calendar year coming up soon, I wanted to spend some time today talking about New Year's resolutions. You probably know what I'm talking about. As we get to the end of December and start the beginning of January, some of us like to look back and reflect on what we've done in the year past, but also to look forward and to resolve to try and improve ourselves in various ways in the year to come. Now, some people might make fun of this. Why should we need an arbitrary change of date to try and better ourselves? But for me, I'm all for it. If a new year is going to help you take up something new, then why not? New year, new you. It's a powerful idea. So, this being a Ruby conference, we won't be talking about exercise or any kind of things like that, but I do have one suggestion to make, and that it's we can try a resolution of thinking about constructing our Ruby apps in a different way. So here we are, this is the talk, Hanami 2, new year, new framework, new you. And this is such great timing to share this because me and the others in the Hanami team, we released 2.0 just 2 weeks ago. And I'm really excited for the possibilities it might unlock, not just for the shape of Ruby apps, but also for each of us as Ruby developers. This is how we got here. Hanami itself began life in 2014, and that's when its first release was. And Hanami was described as a simple, fast, and lightweight web framework, and it brought a strong focus on testability and maintainability. Meanwhile, the DryRB project, which is where I was working, began in 2015, and we released a range of gems trying to help Rubyists write more maintainable application code. Then, come 2018, our two teams realized we were all traveling in largely the same direction, so we joined forces, and after 4 years of largely no conferences, which was good, and a lot of hard work, we made it. Hanami 2 is out. It is, yes, faster, better, stronger. And it combines all the power and flexibility that you might see in DryRB with a really friendly and streamlined out-of-the-box experience. This was a huge team effort, so I want to give a shout out to these legends, particularly Luca and Peter, my teammates on the core team. So if we're going to make trying Hanami our New Year's resolution, we need to plan for it. A plan's important. So here's ours for today. Firstly, we're going to build. We'll get to know the framework by putting some things together. From there, we'll learn more about what it can offer us. And lastly, we'll see how that might help us grow as developers. So now we know what Hanami is generally speaking. Let's get to know it for real. We'll start building with it. The first thing we can do is install the gem, and then we can run the Hanami new command to create a new app. And for today, we'll call our app Bookshelf. And then we can check out the app definition for starters. And this is pretty nice and simple. We won't need to spend too long here. But there is one thing I want to point out, and it's that in Hanami apps, all of our code inhabits the same shared Ruby namespace. So here we have module Bookshelf, which is where our app lives. This is where all the rest of our code will live as well. Now we can check out the routes. And in a fresh app, we have just a simple default welcome string as our starting route. Now, to make our app do something, we need to move on from here. So let's generate an action. And we have a friendly generator to help us do this. So we're going to create a books index action for our bookshelf app. And that has gone and made a new route for us. And this looks pretty simple. We have the books URL pointing to that books index action. Now I think it's time to go check out the action itself. Here's the index action that our generator has made for us. And this is a basic starter action. And in Hanami, actions are the objects responsible for handling all of our HTTP interactions. And the way we structure them is that we have exactly one action for each endpoint. And the handle method here is the most important part of each action because that's where we tell it how to behave. And we're given separate request and response objects that we can work with here. And each of these provides a range of convenient methods, like we can use them to inspect the request parameters, or like we're doing here, set the response body. So speaking of those request params, actions also support flexible param validation schemas. This ensures those params meet all of our expectations, both in terms of their structure and their types. So with this being an index action, we'll want a couple of optional parameters, a page number and a per page value. And we'll want both of these to be integers, and we'll want them both to be greater than 0. This is really useful because now we can return an error response as soon as any of those parameters don't meet our validation requirements. So we've seen here that actions give us a range of useful facilities for dealing with those HTTP interactions, but our books index is still not returning any books. Where can we put our business logic? This is where we can get to know one of Hanami's most important features. And it is that in Hanami, our app is also a container. And the container here works as a central organizing object that's responsible for loading and managing access to all the components in our app. Now, our action we've just created, it's a component already. And we can fetch it from our app just like this, using a key that matches its name. And what we get back is an instance of that action ready for us to work with. In fact, any class that we pass into app can become a component. So we can make a component for a book repo, for instance, that can return a list of books for our action. And it could look something like this. And since we put it in the app repos directory, we can see here that we've given it a matching namespace inside bookshelf. And then we can add a method to return some of the latest books that we've read. Now, this is a very simple repo here. It's obviously a stand-in for something that connects to a real data source. But for the sake of our little app today, it'll do. So now we've got two components. We have our action and we have our repo. But how do we get them to know about each other? Because what we really want is that repo to be used inside our action so we can return that response. Well, for this, we can use Hanami's deps mixin. And we can use this mixin inside any class in a Hanami app. And we can pass it a list of components that we want to have as dependencies. Deps, dependencies. And those components then become available as instance methods that we can use wherever we need inside our classes. And using deps like this is central to how we can create higher level behavior by bringing together a range of smaller, focused components. And in this case, we can use those latest books from our book repo to finally create that JSON response from our action. And now we can spin up our Hanami server, Puma 600 Sunflower, and see that it works. Here's our list of books. So we've made our first working feature with Hanami. Well done, everybody. Hopefully it's helped us to get to know some of how the framework works. And I think it's given us a really great position to now go on and discover a few more of the features that Hanami offers. And we can start by looking at the testing experience. We've just made an action. How do we test it? Well, like every part of Hanami, actions are designed to be directly testable. It means we can call new directly on our action and even pass in a test double for that book repo dependency. That's going to let us control its behavior for the purpose of this test. And that already is enough for us to call our action and then test its response body. Now, this is a pretty low-level isolated test. And for most actions, we won't want to go that far. Probably what would be more useful is an outside-in test, a request spec, something that calls our app by URL. But because all Hanami objects are designed to be directly testable like this, it means we get to make the right choice about the kind of test we need for each situation. So we started interacting with our app code in our tests. We can also do this in the console. And the console loads through the Hanami console command. And inside, we have a nice app shortcut to access our app. And then we can use that app again to access all of our components, which come back already initialized, ready for us to work with. And the console in Hanami always starts quickly, no matter the size of the app. This is because we support two different kinds of boot level. We have one called boot. This is the traditional kind of boot that loads everything up front. It's exactly the kind of thing we'd use when setting up a pre-forking server like Puma. Thanks, Nate, for the excellent introduction this morning. But we also have one called prepare, and this is a super lightweight boot mode, and it does as little as possible just to make our app available. And we use this in all aspects of development, which makes the experience snappy in the console, when running our tests, and when running our local server. One of the things that Hanami will also do during both of these boot modes is load our settings. And these are the values we give our app to make sure it does the right thing in each environment. Things like flags, toggles, keys. And we can define our settings here. So say we want our bookshelf to send emails when new books are added. For this, we might want to use a third-party email delivery API of some kind. So here we can add a setting for its API key. And we'll want to specify here that this setting should be a string. And then during boot, Hanami will load these settings from matching environment variables. And in dev, we have nice .env integration, so we can use a range of different env files as well. And then we can access our loaded settings as another component. And we have methods for each of those settings we just defined. And that means we can also include settings as a dependency of any object thanks to our deps mixin. So we've seen settings, and we've seen the components that are created for us from our app directory. But what about components that might need some kind of special setup as part of getting them ready? Well, this is where providers help. And we need to make one now for our email service. We've just created the setting for its API key, but we didn't need to pass it in somewhere. Providers live in their own folder in config, and here we are setting one up for our email service. And they come with a range of lifecycle steps, and we'll step through them now. For starters, we're going to want to require the gem for that third-party email service. And then we'll grab that API key from the settings that we just created earlier, pass it in to configure that email client, and then we can register that client as a component in our app. And this means that any class using email service as a dependency will get that fully configured client ready for it to work with. So by now we've covered nearly everything we need to know about Hanami apps. But there's one more important thing for us to discover, and that's slices. Slices help us organize our app into separate domains or technical concerns. And they're a fantastic way for introducing modularity and clearer internal boundaries to our app as it grows. Now, you won't see them when we start a new Hanami app, and that's because Hanami can work for really simple apps too, and we want that first run experience to be as simple as possible. But they are built in, and they'll appear as soon as we start putting any code into the slices directory. And we can do this with a slice generator. So here we'll create a slice for admin. And this will prepare an admin slice directory for us. And here we can throw in another action, for instance. We'll let our admins create some books. And just like our app, every slice maps to a single Ruby namespace. So this one maps to the admin namespace. And Hanami creates this slice class for us to use. And that slice works exactly like we just saw with the app. It offers access to all our components. The only difference here is that the components on the slice are confined to whatever's defined in that slice directory. And just like the app, slices also provide a deps mixin as well. And they have the same restriction. They only load the components from inside the slice. So now we've seen that both the app and slices act as containers for our components. And then thanks to that deps mixin, we can also clearly recognize the dependencies between the components and begin to think of them as a directed graph. And from here, we can take things one step further, because slices can also import components selectively from other slices as well, which means we can then envision an equally clear graph of all of our application's high-level concerns. This is a really powerful approach. Here we have the tools built right into a framework to help us better organize our code at every level for easier understanding and maintainability. And one thing we wanted to do for Hanami 2.0 was to extend this experience beyond just web apps to apps of all kinds. Let's take a look at the gem file for a new Hanami app. And this one here, it is a web app because we're including the gems for the router and the controller. However, these are not fixed dependencies of the framework. This is why they're here in the gem file. So if we wanted to build something different to a web app, all we'd need to do is remove those extra lines from the gem file. And with this single core Hanami gem we have remaining, we have all the quality of life features that we just looked at. Containers, components, depths, settings, the console, even slices. And this means we can keep everything we need and nothing we don't. And we can put all those features to use for any kind of app. So Hanami 2 is no longer just a web framework. It's an everything framework. So if you want to build a CLI tool or a chatbot, serverless function, Kafka consumer, but you still want all the conveniences of a full framework and the conventions that it brings, well, now you can do that with Hanami. I'm not sure we've ever had something quite like this in the Ruby community, and I'm really excited to see where people can take it. I'm also really excited for how Hanami might help us grow as Rubyists, because it brings more to the table than just a range of framework features. It provides a new opinion on what app design might look like, and it embodies those opinions in its own design. And I think we can learn from that and apply those principles and turn them into growth as developers. So how can we grow? Well, I think we can start by growing our understanding of our own app's domain. And Hanami encourages this in a few ways. Firstly, it makes one important thing clear from the get-go. The framework is not your app. These are separate things. The framework should work in service of your app, not the other way around. So Hanami routes and actions are designed intentionally to work as really thin gateways into your app. Our business code is ours, and it's supposed to be separated from all the framework-provided facilities. And following from this, if these two things are separate, then we have some extra thinking to do. We need to figure out how to name and organize our business logic code, to find the right arrangement of components and concepts to make our code the most useful expression of our business domain. And because Hanami makes it easy to decompose our logic into those independent, focused components, it gives us the chance to really take control over the shape of our code. So much of this is really about growing our modularity muscle, about boiling things down into those focused components, then combining them together, composing them to create the high-level behavior we want to offer our users. This really boils down to figuring out boundaries. And let's be honest, figuring out boundaries is something that's important for us in every aspect of our lives. But it's equally important in our lives as developers, and it's a skill we're practicing every day. So we'll do ourselves a big favor by choosing to work with a framework that acknowledges this vital activity, and a framework that provides the tools to reason about it, like Hanami does with its depths and slices. And lastly, this gives us a huge chance to grow our Ruby. If we recognize that the core premise of the framework not being the same as our app, well, it means so much more of our app code can be written in plain old Ruby, and that's glorious. And as we build confidence with plain old Ruby, well, it'll do wonders for our ability to think and problem solve fluently in the language. We might even begin to see Ruby through a new lens. We may discover that when we create objects with injected dependencies and then add one or more methods that receive arguments and return a value but otherwise don't change internal state, well, that actually begins to look a little bit like functional programming, and that can bring a huge level of clarity to our code. And picking up Hanami might help us experience a whole new part of the Ruby ecosystem because it builds on and around a rich heritage of gems that are designed for Ruby apps of all flavors. And we might find inspiration for our own code in how some of those gems solve their problems. So there are many chances for us to grow. But at this point, things might feel a bit overwhelming. So if we want to go revisit the whole new framework, new you idea, well, I want to reassure you a little bit with a story. I know new framework, new you is possible because I lived it myself. For me, it started 7 years ago. And at that time, I'd already been writing Ruby for 13 years, which is already a long time. But even then, after all that time, I wasn't feeling happy with how my apps were turning out. I wanted a new approach, but I didn't know how it should look. So I just started looking around, and I found two things. For me, the first one was the ROM gem. And this is the database toolkit, and this is something we'll be integrating with Hanami and bringing to you in the next few months. The second thing was the Rotor gem, which we're so lucky to have Jeremy share with us tomorrow. And these gems, their design, their ideas, the people and community behind them, they opened up a whole new world to me. And then one thing led to another. I picked them up, started playing around, and then I added them to some apps. And then after a while, those apps began to change shape as I really recognized those ideas behind the gems. And then now here I am today, 7 years later, having helped to build a whole new range of gems to make some of these ideas hopefully more accessible than before. And it's been the most fulfilling years of my Ruby life. So no matter where you are on your personal journey as a programmer or with Ruby, I think you can always have the chance to take things in an interesting new direction. So with this in mind and thinking about our resolution, here's a couple of parting tips. Firstly, be curious. There's lots out there to learn, and maybe something like Hanami can be your gateway into a new world of ideas. Be bold. If there's something you see that's interesting, don't hesitate to give it a try. And if that feels unnatural or uncomfortable, then that's a good thing. It means you're learning. Be excited. You might tell, I'm pretty excited about all this. And I think we're at the beginning of a special moment for Ruby, a resurgence of new ideas. And this is your chance to be a part of it. And lastly, be persistent. You can always try and try again. And since we started this whole journey with the idea of it being a New Year's resolution, I think we can all take inspiration from Thailand in that you'll always have a second or third New Year's ahead of you to pick things up and give them another go. So if any of this is interesting to you and you'd like to learn more, you can go to the Hanami website. We've got a great getting started guide now to help you with your first Hanami 2 app. I'm also developing an open source example app on GitHub. It's called Decaf Sucks, and I'm doing it one PR at a time. So if you're interested, you can follow along and see it get put together piece by piece. And I'd love to chat more about any of this. There's probably another hour of content that I chopped from this presentation. So find me at the conference or find me on Mastodon. I'm Tim Riley at ruby.social. Thank you very much.